Hey, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. history from 1877 to present. Today, what we're going to do is recap U.S. history that we've had over the last year. And what we're going to try to do is give you some brief highlights of some of the important points that you have to know when it comes to the Mississippi Assessment Program or the MAP test. Now, what we'll do, we'll start today with Standard 1 Westward expansion from 1877 to present. Now, we've talked about some of these things before, but what we're going to do is kind of refresh your memory. We're going to start by looking at the blueprint for the map assessment for U.S. history. And the one thing that we wanted to point out to you is that if you look on the right-hand side over here in the last column where it says approximate weight, if you look there, it tells you the weighting in terms of how much importance they place on that particular standard when it comes to the assessment. And if you look at the last category, it says contemporary United States, so we're talking about standard 10, 11, and 12, 13 to 30% of the test assessment, of course, will come from that particular standard. So it's going to be very important that you know a whole lot about the Civil Rights Movement. It's going to be very important that you know a whole lot about, Johnson, the Vietnam War, JFK, and Nixon, and then contemporary, of course, will be the modern U.S. history, starting with, President Ronald Reagan through present day. What we're going to do is tell you that when we're looking at today, we're going to concentrate on Standard 1, westward expansion, and the New South trace how economic developments and westward expansion impacted regional differences in democracy and post-Reconstruction era. This is our standard, and we'll have 5 supporting objectives that go along with that Mississippi standard for U.S. history. We're going to start with talking about the Gilded Age, and we're going to talk about Manifest Destiny. We'll begin with Manifest Destiny, and the second lesson that we'll have today, we'll start with the Gilded Age. Manifest Destiny. It was the belief in the destined continental expansion of the United States. It has political, economic, and religious motivations, more economic than anything. The impact of the Civil War and expansion. The aftermath of the Civil War left the United States needing to reconcile the needs of the Union with the reality of westward expansion. The war had disrupted Southern support of expansionism, but it did pave the way for the growth of the national economy, which facilitated further expansion into the West. One of the big issues, of course, with the Civil War was expansion, and then whether or not those states that were being expanded, of course, were going to be slave state or free states. So after the war is over with, slavery is no longer an issue. So the idea of stretching from coast to coast gets even more steam in the United States of America. One of the areas that started some of the expansion would be the Mexican Cession, when the United States of America was ceded this particular land from Mexico to the United States. Because of the Mexican War, the U.S. gained California, Nevada, Mexico, and other territories in the West, and it expanded the nation's reach to the Pacific Ocean. The rise of railroads and corporate expansion. Once again, we said a few moments ago that economics was probably one of the biggest reasons for expansion, because what it would do, of course, is open up avenues for markets in the West. The railroad system played a major role in the opening of the West for settlement and economic development, while large corporations and monopolies like Standard Oil began to exert greater influence over the national economy and political system. The Transcontinental Railroad. One of those other things, of course, that promoted this idea of manifest destiny. The completion of the first Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 played a crucial role in connecting the eastern and western United States, facilitating economic growth. Once again, you keep seeing that word, economic growth, that comes back. And that's one of those things that the test, of course, does concentrate on. Immigration, territorial expansion, as well as the spread of U.S. influence in the Pacific. So not only does it facilitate the fulfillment of an America that goes from the Atlantic coast to the West Coast, but when we get on the West Coast, now we're going to start to look beyond that to the Pacific Ocean and the islands in the Pacific. And we'll talk about that a little bit later also when we talk about imperialism. The Homestead Act of 1862 also encouraged, of course, manifest destiny. Although signed in 1862, the Homestead Act's effects were felt strongly into the 1870s and 1880s. The Homestead Act offered 160 acres of public land to settlers who would cultivate and improve it for 5 years, leading to mass settlement of the western frontier. Western gold rushes. Once again, economics again, money. When you look at expansion in the West, one of the things that was a huge draw for people to come to the West was the discovery of gold and silver throughout the West, which attracted miners, merchants, and businessmen to the West. Sutter's Mill, Comstock Lode, Black Hills in South Dakota, Pikes Peak in Colorado were just a few of the significant strikes that caused the Western migration booms. Indian removal and assimilation. Well, how does Indian removal, of course, impact the expansion of the West? Well, if the Native Americans aren't on the land, then that land, of course, now it's open to white settlement. And one of the things that we'll find is there's going to be a tremendous push to remove the native person from those lands so that it could be open to white settlement. And one of the ways that it happens was through something called the Dawes Act. Policies throughout the late 1800s, like the Dawes Act, sought to relocate and assimilate Native American tribes. Key events like the forced relocation of tribes onto reservations in the battles such as the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where George Armstrong Custer meets his demise, and the violent conflict over land and resources between the U.S. government and Native people was just one of those factors. The Dawes Act of 1887. Not only did it attempt to assimilate the Native American and make him look like a Christian farmer, white Christian farmer, but it also wanted to push him onto his own plots of land so that the rest of the Indian land, of course, could be open to settlement. It aimed to break up Native American communal lands into individual allotments with the hope of encouraging assimilation into mainstream American society. It weakened tribal authority and contributed to the loss of Native American land, opening the land for settlement. And that's what's one of the big impacts of the Dawes Act of 1887. The closing of the frontier. In 1890, after the Oklahoma land rush, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the American frontier had been closed as there was no longer a discernible line of unsettled land. This marked the end of one of the era of expansion and set the stage for a shift toward overseas imperialism. Remember what we said, once the continental United States of America had been expanded and settled, now the United States of America could look beyond the territorial boundaries of the United States of America and look for lands that they could dominate, control, and create markets for, once again, economic growth. All right, what we have here, and we're not going to go over these, but what I did is I created a list of facts that you need to know that accompanies each one of these particular lessons. Here we start with the end of the Civil War in 1865, and it concludes with number 25, the closing of the frontier in 1890. Now these are 25 facts that you can go through, of course, at your own convenience, and if you learn these facts, it'll give you a pretty good basis of the things that you need to know, of course, for a westward expansion. Now, one of the things that I also did is I gave you a hint about something. One of the things that I always found very, very helpful was the creation of flashcards to help me learn a lot of facts and a lot of content in a short amount of time. And I gave you an example how we could do it. Create flashcards with note cards based on the fact list that we have provided you, and it will help you identify what you already know and help you focus on what you don't know. It's an easy way to familiarize yourself with a lot of content. Let's take the Homestead Act, for example. What we want you to do is just get you a 5x7 note card. And what you should do on the front side of the card, ask yourself a question. What was the purpose of the Homestead Act of 1862? And how did it affect westward expansion? And then on the back side of it, what you can do, of course, is write the answer, which says the Homestead Act of 1862 provided 160 acres of public land to settlers who farmed it for 5 years. It encouraged settlement and continued to impact westward expansion after the Civil War. So when you look at those flashcards, once again, it affords you an opportunity to gain a whole lot of knowledge about a whole lot of content in a short time. And it's something, of course, that you could do of course, with with family members, with friends. Anyone, of course, can help you study and get prepared for the U.S. History Map Assessment. Once again, if you don't take some time and get a good background knowledge when it comes to the factual side of the U.S. History test, you may struggle a little bit. But I know that if you follow some of the tips and you listen to some of the things and review the things that we've just reviewed, you'll be in good shape. This is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Good luck to you. Do as well as you possibly can when it comes to the map assessment. See you next time.